Hi,
Okay. Hi, my
hi everyone. My name is Mike Datnewin, and today I am going to be your moderator for this debate. My other wonderful group mates are Danielle, Jamie, Heather, and Caitlin. The roles of the group member will we have are the pro stater is Danielle, and the con stater is Caitlin. The pro prover will be Jamie, and the con prover will be Heather. The pro attacker will be Jamie, and the con attacker will be Heather. Now let's start the debate. In today's day and age, as more children are getting diagnosed with ASD due to better assessment tools, we are in need of early intervention to help the child get a boost to keep up with their typical peers. According to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, in 2012 surveillance year, 1 in 68 children were diagnosed with autism. In 2004, it was 1 in 100, and in 2008, it was 1 in 88 children. So as more and more children are being diagnosed with autism, there is a desperate need for early intervention to help them fill any deficiency they need, such as social skill or receptive skills. As more children and as more and more children are diagnosed with ASD, there is a growing need for more intervention, and one issue that is constantly in debate is whether or not the intervention used to treat ASD needs to be evidence-based. Also, is not having evidence-based intervention an ethical issue? Evidence-based practice is a model of professional decision-making in which practitioners integrate the best available evidence with clients' values, context, and clinical expertise in order to provide services for their client. As individuals who work in the field of ABA, it is important that we comply with all ethical components codes such forth in the professional and ethical compliance code for behavior analysts. Some intervention can be great at treating children with ADHD. They may not be evidence-based, so it is becoming an ethical issue of should this intervention be used if there is no evidence-based research to prove its effectiveness. Evidence-based practice are practices which are backed and supported by many high qualified quality research in the field. There have been many controversy on whether or not evidence-based practice are intervention for the clients. According to the National Standard Project Phase 2, there is currently 14 established evidence-based practice, 18 emerging level of evidence practice, and 13 unestablished intervention for children, adolescents, and for children, adolescents, and young adults under the age of 22. There is intervention that works well with children with autism, but are not considered evidence-based practice. Some believe that the only way to ensure that effective intervention are used, there needs to be an intervention on ensuring only evidence-based intervention are in practice. But if an intervention is proven to be effective, but it lacks evidence-based practice research to back its finding, is that going against the code of ethics? To answer this question, we present to you today a debate on whether or not standardized evidence-based treatment is an ethical issue, and is it really necessity to use only evidence-based practice? We will talk about the pros and cons of it financially, politically, and both the pros and cons of non-evidence-based practice and evidence-based intervention. We will also talk about the legality of non-evidence-based intervention. We will first start with Danielle as our first debater. Thank you.
Evidence-based practices is defined as a program, instructional strategy, intervention, or teaching program that is rigorous evidence of efficacy or effectiveness that result in the consistent positive individual outcomes when tested by randomized controlled studies or quasi-experimental design. Its reliance is based upon scientific knowledge. Standardization could increase treatments being delivered with fidelity, as it would narrow down the broad selection of treatments and manuals could be developed. Standardization of evidence-based practices would guide schools to adopt research treatments that are comprehensive and proven effective for students birth to 22 years of age. Evidence-based practices provides the schools with confidence that the treatment they implement in the educational setting is both reliable and beneficial to the students. Educational professionals would know that treatment satisfies the requirements. Treatment interventions produced by evidence-based practices provide positive outcomes. Treatment interventions did not associate with or produce unfavorable, meaning that the treatment was not found to be ineffective or harmful to the individual during research. Availability of funding might be made accessible for schools if they adopt particular treatment packages. They could be part of the Fidelity Study Group and/or be able to take specific grant money. Of evidence-based practices would allow for facilities and treatment centers with limited resources by being able to select from a more narrow selection of research-based treatments with proven efficacy and effectiveness. Use the best available evidence that is close as possible and use expertise from there. Due to lack of resources, clients should have awareness of treatments and research to support the effectiveness. Facilities and treatment centers with resources to seek various treatment options, evidence-based practices, can be a starting point for treatment because they are proven to be effective. If a factor of treatment is not appropriate, then selecting the treatment would know what they do and do not need when selecting a treatment. Professionals are in control of choosing whether the research available is applicable to their individual client. Professionals can select from a variety of evidence-based practices and treatment packages that align with the client's needs. National Standards Project identified 14 treatments in phase 2 of the project as established for individuals birth to 22 years of age. After a treatment has been selected, it is the responsibility of the professional to continuously collect data and determine if the treatment is effective with their particular client. Studies provide the practitioner with the probability that the intervention would provide effective results. Additionally, using research that has shown to be effective and produce results in at least some cases is better than using a treatment that has not been proven effective. If a treatment has been implemented with fidelity and is not producing effective results or is causing harm to individuals, the professional must use their judgment and cease the particular treatment. National Standards Projects reports and not all established evidence-based practices are expected to produce beneficial results for all individuals with ASD. If there is a lack of research, studies applicable to the situation at hand, professionals can make decisions using caution and use enhanced monitoring techniques while evaluating outcomes.
Sorry. As stated by both Mullen and Strainer and Slocum et al., one of the cons associated with standardization is that it could strip away individualization and appropriateness for the client if only effective treatments were allowed to be funded by insurance. So in this sense, they meant that just if you have to pick from a list of practices to use, they feel as though you can't really individualize that to the client, and that each client is different and might have different needs and might need things tweaked and edited to fit that client's needs, and requiring evidence-based practice, they feel as though you can't truly individualize a program to the specific client. They also feel this could lead to an exhausted ABA field by all of the research resources only being done on certain standardized effective treatment. They feel this would take away from emerging techniques, because if researchers can only get funding for things that are proven evidence-based practice, then they feel like people aren't going to try and find new techniques and new procedures and protocols, because like the resources and the funding isn't there, and they should just kind of funnel their efforts into things that are evidence-based practice. Additionally, the authors feel that this could lead to nilicism. Researchers feel there's no research that's good enough to be deemed evidence-based practice. That would mean that researchers would be overly critical on each other, especially if it has to be, it has to go through so many rigors that would make it eligible to be deemed evidence-based practice. They would be so critical of each other that they would feel nothing met the standards, nothing could be good enough. And that could rule out a lot of research that could lead to new protocols and procedures. The authors also listed that using systematic reviews to create lists of evidence-based practice is a risk to leaving out important studies that may be excluded solely due to search criteria. So when the NSP2 created their established, emerging, and unestablished lists, what they did was search all of the research available using certain keywords and searching certain studies using different keywords. And these authors felt as though good studies might be left out just because they don't match the right keywords to fit into the searches that are being used. Additionally, published research rarely includes enough description for application, which often leads to providers not implementing evidence-based practice correctly. Evidence-based practice takes time to implement in the classroom, and so when training others will be time-consuming, in which many places may not have the time to properly train their staff. Due to the lack of training, the article states that only 60% of teachers who adopt the practice would implement with fidelity. So all of those points lead to the same direction. They feel as though there won't be enough information in a research study for someone to look at it and know exactly every part of the practice to implement it with fidelity. And even if they do understand it, it often takes a lot of time and a lot of training that many places don't have the time or resources for, and that especially when it comes to in schools, only 60% of teachers would implement procedures with fidelity. Additionally, particularly for teachers, looking up the most recent literature regarding a client's needs may not be practical given the time constraints. So one of the requirements for evidence-based practice is that you are making sure that in the moment you are looking up the most recent and most relevant resources. And they're saying for teachers particularly, and especially in a classroom setting, if they have more than one student, if they're trying to figure out how to handle a solution with one student, they may not have the time to take out and go look up what would be the best and most recent evidence-based practice to handle this one issue, rather than, pull something out of their bag of tricks, so to speak, in the moment, instead of going to a computer and taking out 15 minutes to look up an evidence-based practice. The authors also felt that evidence-based practice creates a cookbook practice. Using evidence-based practice leads practitioners to not using their own reasoning and judgment. And this goes against the ethics code of 1.01, which is reliance on scientific knowledge, where behavior analysts rely on professionally derived knowledge based on science and behavior analysis when making scientific or professional judgments in human service provision or when engaging in scholarly or professional endeavors. So in this sense, they're saying that people are just looking to this list and picking something off of this list and not really relying on their own knowledge of the field and their own experience and practice, and not using their own judgment, which goes against the Ethical Code 1.01. I'm now going to pass it over to our pro-prover, Jamie.
Evidence-based practices integrate the best available research with clinical expertise in terms of clients' values, cultures, and preferences. They advance the field and help ensure the perspective that the opinions of experts are just that, opinions, and that research-supported evidence should be the main focus. Clinical judgment can be misguided, and requiring practitioners to follow the best available evidence will lead to better results. It is also important to note that evidence-based practices do not negate the use of practitioners' judgment, but does require a basis or a standard for practitioners to adhere to. Moreover, practitioners that use established research can be more confident that there is a higher probability that an intervention will provide effective results because there is actual research to support their conclusions. In addition, by using studies that have shown success in certain cases over methods that have not shown any evidence of effectiveness, is more valuable. There are many interventions that exist. However, scientific research has found only some of these interventions to be effective. And in that case, we have to look to our clients and the resources that our clients have. Treatment can be very expensive, and many clients lack the resources to gain access to a variety of treatments. It is essential that resources be maximized for effectiveness. Progress can be very slow. Parents can get really frustrated when their child is not making the progress that they want. And if they see these new study or new treatments based on anecdotal evidence stating that this helped this one child, so it can help yours, and they may spend their money on a treatment that has no evidence to support that it is effective, they're using the resources that could actually have been used for something shown to be effective. So using evidence-based practices allows clients to utilize those resources for treatments. And without evidence-based practices, parents, clients can also be overwhelmed by all the different choices that are open to them. We don't want them to waste their resources on treatments that have no evidence to support their effectiveness. Additionally, when talking about funding and grants and those kinds of resources, we may see that there's more funding available for schools if they adopt a particular type of treatments that have shown support, that have shown effectiveness. And that in relation could help those schools to get more funding to help implement the most effective resources. For example, PECS does not necessarily have the support that it needs or evidence-based practices, but in many instances show that there is a lack of funding to support that type of intervention. So if we can see support for these interventions, then schools can get the funding that they need to implement these treatments effectively. I will now pass it over to Heather, our con prover.
Thank you, Jamie. Well, I'll start with, the pro side has talked about a better definition of evidence-based practices if it were to be standardized. There's also been a mention about that it can increase the number of treatments that are being implemented with fidelity. So to first address a better definition for evidence-based practices, that can go both ways. There was comments that had been found by Slocum, Dietrich, Wilczynski, Spencer, Lewis, and Wolf in 2014 that they questioned if there were to be a poor conceptualization of evidence-based practices, that could actually be of harm in regards to how we communicate about evidence-based practices, or when applied behavior analysis is heavily tied into those. It seems today there's a lot of talk within schools, or where often it's general education teachers, where they feel that applied behavior analysis is only about reinforcing children with things that they want, like withholding. It's, you know, that there's definitely a preconceived notion that it's about bribery. If now, as far as the funding, that for schools, yes, it would mean that they would get more funding, but once again, they do get funding for other programs within special education, and often they still fall short on implementing those services with fidelity as it is now. You know, just as Jamie had stated, with the PECs being in school districts, that, according to the NSP2, was only listed as an emerging treatment, and it's been around since the 60s. But because of the lack of funding, even though it did make the list as emerging, there's still a great lack of implementation with fidelity on that method of communication treatment. It is true that there would become less of a selection. It would narrow down a lot of what is out there. You know, people would only look at what has been heavily researched, but there still needs to be a defined level of accountability for implementation after the standardization, because this comes down to, okay, this is an evidence-based practice that's shown great outcome, but those same outcomes will not be met unless there is a more strict level of accountability, teacher mentoring. You know, often you find that when there's a new implemented system in a school or in a facility, like a developmental day treatment center or day have center, some of those staff have only went to 2 or 3 day workshop trainings, and they're expected to come back with no mentoring, no coaching, no follow through on checking the level of competency in regards to how they're implementing it within the classroom or the facility as a whole. So ultimately, yes, standardization can provide confidence for schools, but until there's a standardized method of ensuring teacher preparedness and training, it would still be at a cost of influx on outcomes. These statements that I'm making right now, it aligns with what Caitlin had said in regards to they have lack of training, there's lack of time. Because in schools, teachers, speech pathologists, occupational therapists, and special education teachers have such a level of accountability for paperwork and all of the conferences that are held within school districts. And there is likely not going to be that time where they can, just as Caitlin said, log in and check to see what the next standardized move would be in addressing student behaviors or students' lack of progress. The last few things I want to bring up are, the worry would be that on a financial side of this, to attack this, I would say possibly it's going to lead insurance companies to only agreeing to pay for the fastest and cheapest interventions, which would be these possible standardized evidence-based practices. And this would clearly be working against the code of ethics that a behavior analyst must uphold and what these practices must uphold. That would be a major societal impact because we would be limited on choosing appropriate and effective treatments. And then also a lot of the research that has been done on these evidence-based practices is usually done within a specific population, and in having that restricted population, you can't always generalize that to across the board. You can't generalize it to a classroom. Some of these have been set up in clinical facilities, and the context wouldn't be accurate. And it can also, the evidence-based practices, if they have a lack of individualization often, and especially if you were to standardize them, that would lead to complete restriction on thinking about how to individualize a certain program for a student, because it would be so tempting to just look up and see what the next spiral part of that practice is going to be and address that behavior, as opposed to having the freedom to make a judgment-based decision, you know, what that's available to you upon your own training. At this point, I'd like to trade it back over to the pro attacker, Jamie.
So introducing a practice that is not evidence-based is not enough to make progress. We can't just say that there's a lack of funding, there's lack of resources, therefore we should just do what works. We need to know what is the most effective to work. Saying that a teacher doesn't get the training necessary to implement an evidence-based practice doesn't mean that the evidence-based practice isn't still the best option for a child. It just means that we need to find a way to get the funding, to get the resources, so that our students, those individuals that need it, can get the best option, the treatment that is the most beneficial for them. And that is what evidence-based practices is. It's looking at the research. It's looking at what has been effective. And in order to say that it is an evidence-based practice, it does have to be implemented with fidelity. It does have to be implemented concisely in order to be effective. So yes, I agree that the evidence-based practices do need to be rigorous and do need to be followed to a T in order to gain the progress that research has shown that they can make. Moreover, evidence-based practices do take into the individualization of students, and knowing that there are different needs. It does take into the culture and the characteristics of the individual. That's part of the definition of evidence-based practices. So it can be effective for each student. But again, seeing that there are so many options out there, but there's so much lack of resources, lack of funding. Parents and children need to have the minimal acceptable offering, which is what evidence-based practices are. That's what they stand for. They show effectiveness. They show that this treatment has been shown through research, through just support, that this is the best available option. And just saying that we don't have the funding or we don't have the resources ethically does not align with the principles of our field. We need to be able to give individuals the best option in order to make the progress that they need to be sorry, I'm thinking the word now. That's what I'll write down. As autonomous as they could be. I'll turn it back over to Heather. Sorry.
Thank you, Jamie. This approach is going to be the con attacker. And just like Jamie said, you know, and Mike said it too, we do want to look at what's best for the clients that are involved in the services. And, funding's always a nice talk, because the practices, just as Jamie had stated as well, those practices are so expensive. And that's why, it does mean that we need to assess and determine what are the best options for the clients that we're looking at. And that can go on, once again, either side of the fence. Is, yes, a standardized option might make sense because it's so heavily researched, and it has the proof. Maybe a meta-analysis had been completed and it wound up at the top of the list. But once again, that can go to the other side of the fence if the best practice for that child might be a sensory integration therapy, or something that has not made it to the top of the list on the NSP2. I'm going to do a screen share here. Hopefully I have enough technological savviness to do this. Wow. Okay. Hey guys, is that working at all?
It came up for a minute, like you could see the whole thing, and then you clicked something and it looks like it's like, okay, now I see it again.
Yay. Okay. This is this is actually a screenshot from the NSP. And this is what they have found to be the list of established interventions, which there are 4. I believe Danielle had stated that. But what's missing on the established is, once again, like the structured teaching models, the PECs, that's down here on way down here. Now I am going to actually put these in slideshows so that I can use them a little bit more readily. This is what they had found as emerging. And one of the biggest buzzwords right now is picture exchange communication. And we also see structured teaching here on that list. And the structured teaching comes down to the STAR program or the TEACH model. And both are strategic teaching models based upon research in the field of autism. You go farther down on the list for the unestablished interventions. What's shocking enough is you see the sensory integration packages and a lot of sensory integrative therapy. And, research has found that those are able to be applied in order to reduce student seeking behaviors within the classroom. And, movement-based interventions, those have been found to help a student work out the energy or do less seeking behavior within the classroom. And I'm going to try to quit screen sharing. Hopefully that works, and it did. Okay. But the point is according to the NSP, for the adults with autism, ages 22 and up, there's only 1 emerging, and there are 4 under established. This alone sort of speaks to the fact that there's just not enough research out there right now. According to what had been stated by Odom in 2009, he stated that the low quality rating for the emerging and non-emerging established evidence-based practices on the NSP was due to the lack of utilizing randomized controlled trials, methodology, and research. And what needs to be noted is this is always the case with classroom-based interventions. They're difficult to implement and they are expensive to conduct. And it wasn't until after the year 2000 that governmental agencies have actually been willing to provide funds at the magnitude needed to conduct the rigorous efficacy research. And, so what that means is there very well may be new research findings and things that make those lists for established or emerging that weren't on this list the last time. And, at that point, then, yeah, maybe we could view to standardize evidence-based practices and try to make it more of a package for schools or facilities. But based upon that, right now the list is pretty limited, and some of the things that were listed as emerging they've been practiced since the 60s. And due to the new governmental funding, the evidence-based practices are now being evaluated, but there will remain a concern about the widespread replication of those and how they'll be implemented with or without fidelity, and if those outcomes are going to match what had been found during those randomized clinical trials. And, once again, we can refer back to the code that this is possibly violating the assessment of behaviors, and, that we need to be looking at the behaviors to drive how we're addressing the students or the student body, especially with, you look at school-wide behavior support plans. That kind of folds into what we're talking about in this debate, is standardizing those. And the struggle that the schools have with the school-wide positive behavior support plans, these would more than likely align if there was a standardization of evidence-based practices. And so we just need to create a strong assessment instruments for the implementation of the evidence-based practices. We need to do, if there is a standardization of it, there needs to be a strong assessment for what's going to be the most beneficial to be adopted by the school. And there's a lot of thought that has to go into that in research beyond what's already been done, just beyond the NSP 2. But the good studies, and it's like Caitlin said, the good studies have been left out due to the strict wording that was used in that NSP 2. And that refers back to what Odom had stated, that, a lot of these that made that list weren't sent through randomized clinical trial methods. And those are what are the most efficient in ensuring that a treatment or a practice is going to be effective. And at this time, I'd like to turn it back over to the pro stater, Danielle, and she'll do some closing arguments in support.
You guys, I'm not at home anymore, so I don't have my paper. So can we pass it to Caitlin, who will do the constater to close it up?
Okay, guys, so just to wrap up everything that has been addressed, as Heather mentioned, some of the biggest points against standardization is the fact that studies that are conducted are usually done in very controlled settings, clinical settings, and it would be very difficult to automatically assume that these will translate well to the classroom setting. Just because this was affected in the clinic does not mean that it will work for a teacher in a classroom with 30 students. In addition, sorry, caught off guard. let me scroll back up to everything I said earlier. In addition, we don't want a cookie cutter practice. Everyone that works within this field gets further education and, you know, expands their knowledge base and works to learn more about the field and gain more experience. And to say that A then B equals C in every situation is not only unethical and goes against the code of ethics, but also leads practitioners to feel exhausted. It leads researchers to feel exhausted, and that they shouldn't put their efforts and any potential funding they get into things that are not already evidence-based practice, because it could be a waste of their time in a sense, because their study might not meet the search criteria for any new national standards project, or they may just not get the funding that they need to try and research something new. Additionally, there's the concern that if standardization happens and practices have to be evidence-based practice, insurance companies might require that in order for them to cover services, it has to only be evidence-based practice, which, as Heather said, in our current state would lead to a very limited practice, especially for adults over the age of 22. If you can only pick from a list of these practices, you're not really meeting the needs of any clients, because they're sure clients have, you know, more than one need. And to say that you have to pick from this extremely limited list in order to get funding or be covered by insurance would be doing a disservice, not only to the clients, but the practitioners as well. I was my plan was to go off of and try and go against whatever Danielle said. So since I don't have that, I'm kind of just saying things I've already said. Yeah, so I'm going to turn it back over to Mike, who will close.
So we heard some very good arguments between both the pros and cons of evidence-based practices and non-evidence-based practices. We will let you guys decide which one you guys think is the best. Thank you for watching the debate, and have a good night or good day. Should we stop the recording?
Sure.